Welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin our second day on Unit 5.1, the Enlightenment. All right, and so we're looking at the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, and doing some application today. All right, so we'll be doing some contextualization of these philosophers, making some comparisons. All right, and our learning objective today is explain the intellectual and ideological context in which the revolutions swept the Atlantic world. So hopefully you'll be better prepared to be able to do that today after we go through this and then explain how the Enlightenment affected societies over time. All right, so hopefully we'll try to start making some of those connections. So this is what we had worked on yesterday, and I just kind of finished this. We did not complete this in class. We did the three primary causes and the events and this kind of skill application associated with a couple of them. And that's really where we left off. All right. So, as far as the contextualization, like today, we're going to go through a couple of the contextualizations, like the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. Those would be really kind of good ways to contextualize something like the American Revolution. But just generally speaking, for the other ones, rise of humanism would be a good way to contextualize. The printing press would be another good way to contextualize. It's what good is the writings of Locke or Rousseau if their works cannot be disseminated out to a wider population? So those are both kind of good contextual ideas. All right, listed off a bunch of others that are kind of more European history specific. Connections could be made, but I kind of bolded the four that are kind of most relevant to the American Revolution specifically. As far as secondary causes, we'll also kind of talk about these specifically when we get into specific case studies. All right. So you don't need to complete those unless obviously you want to. All right, so let's get right into it. All right, and let's talk about Hobbes. All right, so who is Hobbes? Who is Thomas Hobbes? What is Thomas Hobbes advocating? All right, so when we look at him in class, a couple kind of basic things to keep in mind is, Hobbes lives within a world dominated by absolute monarchy, right? Absolute monarchs. So, right, so let's just kind of draw out a few things here, right? So, right, and we have monarchs at the time of Hobbes, and those monarchs claimed divine right to rule, right? They got their authority to rule from God, right? And they ruled over their people, claiming divine right. All right. Boom, boom, boom. All right. And we refer to them as absolute monarchs. Right? And it is within that context of absolute monarchs that Thomas Hobbes, right? Thomas Hobbes writes his famous works. Right? So T. Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, right? And so what does Thomas Hobbes advocate? Right? Thomas Hobbes advocates, now men may agree together, but there is no security unless there is a power to enforce the covenant. Such a power can be created only if they agree to confer all their power on one man. This is the generation of that Leviathan, to which we owe our peace and defense. All right, so what is Hobbes advocating here? Hobbes is advocating conferring all power to one single person. Thus, Hobbes, right, kind of look at what Hobbes is actually advocating for here, right? Hobbes is advocating for monarchy, right? He's advocating for absolute monarchy. Right? And why is he advocating for absolute monarchy? Right? He's calling for a Leviathan. Right? This is a biblical reference. Right? So he believes that humans exist in a primitive state of nature. Right? And that so what does that mean? That means people are inherently right? Selfish, greedy, right? Want to take care of themselves. And in that human beings, we consent to be governed. Thus, we give up some of our freedoms so that we will be protected, right? We want someone to protect us from the mob in the street, right? So, right, humans, right, humans are inherently bad. Double horns, right? Humans are inherently bad. Double tail here. There you go. Humans are inherently bad, and we need a Leviathan. We need a Leviathan to protect us. All right. I guess I should make those eyes a little scarier. Maybe select outwards. These look like eyelashes now. All right, so we need a Leviathan, right? A powerful king in order to protect us, right? So, right, what context is he writing this in? Why is he advocating, right, for this? Of course, contextually. All right, so contextualization. Contextualization matters, right? He is writing in the immediate aftermath of the English Civil War, all right? Now, this is not a European history course, so do you really need to know about the English Civil War? I mean, kinda, right? I mean, it's kind of an important to understand Hobbes and eventually Locke, right? So it is kind of important to understanding how we got to the kind of governmental philosophies. So in a nutshell, I'm going to run through the English Civil War in about 5 minutes here, or less. So you've got, with the death of Elizabeth I, I think it was 1603 off the top of my head, right? That ends the Tudor line, and the British government will then invite in the Stuart family. You might be familiar with the Stuarts, maybe King James I. You might be familiar with him. You may have heard of the King James Bible before, right? So kind of they commission an English language Bible for the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, right? So you may be familiar with that, right? And King James will reign for 20 plus years, without any kind of thing that we need to talk about in AP world history. He will be followed by, he'll be followed by Charles I. And Charles I will be looking at what's going on over in France, right? He's seeing, the Estates General is not being called. That's their legislative body. So the ruler over in France doesn't have to deal with any kind of legislative body at all. And Charles wants to increasingly be like Louis XIV. And so we see, the Charles encroaching on the traditional authority of Parliament. Parliament pushes back, and eventually Charles will dissolve the Parliament. And you may be familiar with the kind of most famous person associated with this. The leader of Parliament at the time was Oliver Cromwell. So Oliver Cromwell is not going to take this laying down. He will raise an army and fight for the rights of Parliament. And so we have a war breakout, a civil war breakout. So we have, we have Charles I and his army. They're known as the Cavaliers, right? So if you've ever heard of the University of Virginia Cavaliers, that's named after the forces of Charles I. Cleveland Cavaliers, right? There you go. All right, so that's what that's referring to, right? And they were fighting against the armies of Cromwell. They were known as the Roundheads, mostly because of their haircuts, I believe is what I've read about this. So they put they would cut it, kind of like a bowl cut, I guess. Right? They put a bowl on your head, you cut it, you shave everything under it, and then what's left looks like a bowl cut. Right? So they called them the Roundheads. Anyway, the war takes place. Eventually, the Cavaliers lose. Cromwell wins. Charles I is tried for treason, for disbanding Parliament, and is found guilty and has his head cut off. Right, so and I always kind of ask in class, what it's called when a king loses his head, and the kids always say decapitation, and that is the word we use to describe when it happens to a regular person, but when that happens to a king, right, when a king is killed, we call it regicide, right? So regicide is committed by Cromwell here, right? So what we have is after that we have a period it's really the 1650s. we have about a decade-long period where there is no king or queen of England. There's no monarch. Parliament reigns with Cromwell at its head, right? And what we see during that time period is, what could be considered, mob rule, rule by the whims of Cromwell, and people are afraid to push back against him. So, what exactly does he do wrong? He does a lot wrong, but most notably, what he does in Ireland is often a kind of an exception, to the norms, right? So, thousands are killed in Ireland. The period of Cromwell's rules in Ireland is known as the Troubles. And really anti-Catholic, right? Cromwell was a Puritan, and was extremely anti-Roman Catholic, and he even attacked the Church of England, the Anglican Church, trying to root out Roman Catholic elements within the Anglican Church that had persisted through the Reformation. Right, so we see Cromwell, violating all kinds of norms. Eventually, Parliament will push back, and he eventually himself will be tried and have his head chopped off as well. So Cromwell would be beheaded. His head will then be placed up on the wall of the Tower of London. And his body is quartered and buried in the four parts of England. All right, so he will not rest in peace. Right. So Hobbes is contextually writing in the midst of all this. Right. This is kind of the wider context that we see Hobbes advocating a strong Leviathan to prevent, the mob rule that we see during the reign of Cromwell. And this is exactly what England gets, right? So when once the Cromwellian era is over, Charles II, right? The Stuarts are invited back, and we get another long reign of the Stuarts under Charles II. Right, a Leviathan has returned. All right, and then this brings us to eventually William and Mary. William and Mary are not an Enlightenment philosoph. These are monarchs, and they are significant monarchs because after the death of Charles I, we have James II. Sorry, after the death of Charles II, James II comes to power, and he will not give up his Roman Catholicism, right? And this is going to create another crisis in England. And, Parliament has to come up with a way to deal with this crisis. And William and Mary is the compromise, all right? So when we talk about John Locke, right, so let's kind of move to the next person, right? We know John Locke. All right, so John Locke. All right, what do we know about John Locke? I guess I could highlight some of this stuff, or at least kind of denote the names here. All right, so John Locke, right, and contextually, let me just kind of throw contextualization in here. All right, things that we associate with him is the Glorious Revolution. All right, the Glorious Revolution, and that is in 1688. So what we do here is we overthrow the monarchy, right? We overthrow the monarchy in 1688. So it is a revolution, but it is a bloodless revolution, hence the name Glorious Revolution. So in 1688, they evict James II from the crown. He eventually goes to France, and they invite in William of Orange, right, from the Netherlands. Right, William and Mary. Right, William and Mary. And we see the establishment of a constitutional, S-T-I-T-U-T-I-O-N, constitutional, I don't think how to spell that, monarchy. Right, we see the rise of a constitutional monarchy. And of course, William and Mary will sign the English Bill of Rights. All right, in 1689, and of course that is written by Locke, right? That is written by Locke. So Let's take a second real quick and run through this. So what we see here is the English Bill of Rights. William and Mary will sign away, or William will sign away his authority to Parliament. So he is a king in name, and the natural rights are preserved with this agreement. So William and Mary cannot suspend laws. They cannot pass taxes without permission of Parliament. Parliament is free to petition the king whenever they want. Parliament can determine when and where they have their own elections. They're allowed. Parliament is allowed to speak, right, their mind freely without fear of any punishment. No cruel and unusual punishment. And Parliament makes laws, right? So you see a massive signing away of authority, with the English Bill of Rights, all right? So when we think about John Locke, right, we have all, famous quote, all mankind being equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, liberty, or property, right? Thus being the reason why we have a government is to protect individual rights. So people are sovereign, consent to the government, right, for protection of natural rights. Thus, I only consent to be governed, right, for the government to protect my natural rights. So let's kind of draw this out here. All right, so Locke, let's kind of keep using this blue, I guess. All right, so what are the three major rights here? All right, what are my natural rights? Life, liberty, and property. All right, this is the wall of government, right, is created to protect life, liberty, and property. These are my natural God-given rights. All right, these are my natural rights. All right, so, and this, of course, is the purpose of government under Locke. All right, government exists to protect, right? Government is the barrier to protect these individual rights. All right, natural rights, individual rights. All right, so that's why government exists. Plain and simple. All right, they will protect me, and they will protect my rights. All right, so that is Locke. All right. And of course, when you look at Locke in the English Bill of Rights, you can see here the direct connection to the Bill of Rights, right? That gets ratified in the years after the Constitution, and you can see this kind of super close connection between the rights that are preserved by the United States government and the rights that were preserved by the English Bill of Rights for English citizens. Right, so when you look at what the American Revolution kind of is in the larger perspective, a lot of what the American colonists were fighting for in the American Revolution was to maintain the same rights that Englishmen would have had 90 years earlier. All right, so looking to preserve and maintain those rights. And of course, these protections get embedded within the U.S. Constitution with the Bill of Rights. All right, so you can see a real similarity comparison here between Bill of Rights, English Bill of Rights, and the American Constitutional Bill of Rights. All right. Next guy, Montesquieu. All right, Montesquieu, and of course you all know Montesquieu. I don't know how you would ever get into this class without knowing Montesquieu. All right, so what is Montesquieu saying here? In every government, there are three sorts of power: the legislative, executive, and the judicial. When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or same body, there can be no liberty, lest the same person or body should enact tyrannical laws and execute them in tyrannical manners. All right. So what is he saying here? The best form of government is one which divides up and separates power. All right. So let's kind of drop this down. Montesquieu. All right. Montesquieu. Montesquieu. All right. So he wants separation of powers. All right, separation of powers. And, right, of course, you all know how this works in the United States, right? So the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch. All right. And when you kind of look at what he's saying here, right, is right, do not trust government. Right? Keep it divided. Right? Keep it divided, keep it separated. There is a true danger when power is all in one place, right? So chop up that power as much as you can. So Montesquieu and his ideas are very compatible with Locke, right? These two work very, very well together because if the whole purpose of government is to protect individual rights, life, liberty, and property, the best way you can maintain those rights and protect those rights is to prevent government from consolidating into a single entity where it can become tyrannical. All right. So of course you'll see the application of this with the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution will chop up authority not just into multiple branches, but you'll also see it chopped up into bicameral legislatures as well. All right, so that's Montesquieu. Next guy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All right, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Gotta love saying that name. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All right, so let's draw my arrow down here and that name, Roussseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All right, so let's go through a couple quotes of his. Every law the people has not ratified in person is null and void, is in fact not a law. Thus, the U.S. Constitution today, from the perspective of Rousseau, is irrelevant because that was not ratified by anyone who is alive today. All right. So these all laws have to be re-ratified with every generation. Right. So man is born free, and yet we see him everywhere in chains, bound by the laws of previous generations, right? That are these traditions that are maintained and upheld. The problem is to find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate. Right. So what do we think of when we think of him? Government is a contract between the rulers of that time and the people of that time. Right? The good of society is more important than the protection of individual rights. All right, so when we look at Rousseau, right, what are we kind of thinking about with Rousseau? All right, we see here, his most famous piece, right, the social contract, right? So the government plus the people, right, are act as one, right? So there is a social contract, right, between these two, right? And these are not, right? These two are not as compatible. All right, so let's just kind of draw a little not so much. Okay, these Rousseau and Montesquieu don't work very well together, right? So you're seeing with Rousseauian, right? You have the consolidation of power so that the will of the people, right, can be expressed. All right, so let's kind of just put that down there, right? The will of the people, right? The will of the people expressed. All right. So this is something in which people like Montesquieu warned about, right? So they warned about the ideas that if you allow the will of the people to be expressed through government, then if that happens, then individual rights will be trampled upon. All right. So let's just say kind of good of society more important than natural rights. Right. So the good of society, right? You should give up your civil liberties for the good of whatever, right? So that is Rousseau, right? That is Rousseau, and of course we see application of this all throughout history. Parliament is more, as a form of government, is more prone to Rousseauian application. So even governments that are kind of formed around Locke can easily move to Rousseau in application if those divisions are not firmly in place, right? So governments that do not have a tradition of preserving Lockean ideas are are susceptible to Rousseauian transition if this barrier is not in place. All right. Lastly here. I also should say there is a component of the U.S. government that is Rousseauian, right? And that is, in the U.S. government. Let's see if I can shade of green. Sure, I do somewhere around here. All right. So in the U.S. government, we have the House of Representatives. All right, the House of Representatives. This is the kind of Rousseauian application in the U.S. government, where the will of the people is expressed, the people's house, as it is often referenced, right? So that is a Rousseauian application, right? However, that Rousseauian application in the U.S. government is restricted, by the bicameral legislature as well as the judicial branch and the executive branch. All right. So that's Rousseau. All right, and then lastly, Voltaire. All right. So it does not require great art or magnificently trained eloquence to prove that Christians should tolerate each other. Right. This is referring to the Roman Catholic Protestant Reformation with its various denominations. Right. The divide between the two. So, however, I am going further. I say that we should regard all men as our brothers. What? The Turk, my brother, referring to Muslims, the Chinaman, my brother, the Jew, the Siam, referring to Thailand was known as Siam at that point in history. Yes, without doubt. Are we not all children of the same Father and creatures of the same God? So what is Voltaire advocating here? Religious toleration. Another famous quote from Voltaire: I do not agree with what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. So freedom of expression, right? Voltaire was, very strongly anti-censorship, right? The best way to combat misinformation is with more information, right? Censorship breeds mistrust, of the regimes that are trying to apply censorship. So censorship is never a valid, right, answer. All right, so Voltaire, right? What should we have for Voltaire? So here's our last person, right? Voltaire. Right, maybe someday you'll read Candide. Right? So what do we see with him is we really kind of look at religious tolerance. Religious tolerance. So we've got the church, right? Church. Steeple on top there. That's probably the most awful church you've ever seen. Right, church and state. Right, so it's kind of dry state shape that you might be familiar with, right? So religious tolerance, and that there needs to be a division between the church and the state, right? And and of course, I like this idea of using the letter V of Voltaire's name to symbolize the split between the state and religion. All right. Separation of church and state. All right, so these are the kind of basics of the people that we look at. So I do have a little organizing chart here for you that gives you the philosophers, their kind of most well-known books, right? Their interests and their claims, and then what their connections are, right? So sometimes these are contextual connections, like with Hobbes and the English Civil War. Sometimes they're contextual plus how they get applied out. So like Locke, contextually, he is the Glorious Revolution. Of course, he's going to directly influence the American Revolution, right? So the Declaration of Independence is, references Locke specifically, and of course, the Bill of Rights will apply Locke's ideas. Montesquieu, right? So Montesquieu will, be extremely influential in the creation of the United States Constitution, right? And the Federalist Papers are embedded with Montesquieuian ideas from his famous book, Spirit of the Laws, right? So Voltaire, right? First Amendment, right? Influential for that, right? One must cultivate one's own garden. All right, Rousseau, right? So when you look at Rousseau, the social contract, individual rights, one finds freedom by sacrificing some individual rights for the common good, right? So, when you, when we look at this, right, where do we see this in history? Anytime where we see power is consolidated into the hands and the will of the people is being expressed. So, the French Revolution during the Jacobin phase, the Russian Revolution in the 1920s into the 30s, right? So Lenin, right, kind of early Bolshevism, Stalin, Germany in the 30s, China after 1949, right? China after 1949. Maybe Australia after 2020. You might be able to make an argument for a transition away from Lockean towards Rousseau. So Parliament makes countries parliamentary rule without a separate judiciary or without a strong judiciary that's capable of overruling the parliamentary acts. Makes it possible for that transition to take place, even with a Lockean tradition, right? Others, people like Smith, right? Economics. We'll talk about Smith at a later date, but he's also part of this kind of greater Enlightenment. Enlightenment generally is considered to have ended with the death of Rousseau and Voltaire. And that happens a year after, 2 years after Wealth of Nations is published. So Smith falls kind of in under that line. Wollstonecraft's a little after, right? So, but she generally still gets equated with Enlightenment thinkers, right? And we'll talk about her tomorrow. Equal individual rights. Women are rational. Women should have political rights, including voting and holding office, right? So she's going to be influential in some aspects of the French Revolution, although not a lot of actual gains are made during or after the French Revolution. But Seneca falls, the rise of the suffragette movement, and the eventual women's suffrage, right, kind of come into completion in countries like the United States with the 19th Amendment. All right, so your homework for tonight is really just kind of an application homework. So you're going to be asked to read a passage and then find the Enlightenment ideals in the text. So let's do this one really quick together, and then you'll have two other little short pieces like this in your homework. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, government are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This is from the American Declaration of Independence, 1776. All right, so what should you get for a main idea? The power of government comes from citizens, and citizens have the right to change their government. Right, so what Enlightenment ideal is being applied here? Unalienable rights. Right, all men are created equal. Right, we see application of Locke. You could also have made a connection with Rousseau. Right, with his consent of the governed piece. Right? You could so you could have gone a couple of ways with that one there. All right, and the rest of your homework, just let me show you real quick. So you've got a little excerpt here from the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens, and then you have another excerpt from the letter from Jamaica, the Simone Bolivar letter. And you're just doing the exact same thing. What is the main idea of that passage, and what is the Enlightenment idea that is being expressed? All right. So once you do that, right, that is, that was your homework for tonight. I also assigned a brief little extra credit thing if that's something you want. A historical hand turkey Enlightenment edition. This is not required. You don't have to do this. But basically, with Thanksgiving coming up, a little extra credit homework passy kind of thing here. So, create a hand turkey, draw the face of one Enlightenment thinker. What is their big idea? Give me a famous quote on that finger. Identify an example of how their ideas affected society. So what impact does their ideas have? And then give me a fun fact. Right. So historical hand turkey. Right. So no printing, typing. Does not have to be in color. But it should not be a trash can turkey. Right. It still should look nice. Must be 100% completed, and I want it by class tomorrow. Right. So if you do, you'll get a homework pass for completing the hand turkey. All right. That is all for today. Sapriati.